This is a very, very impromptu panel proposed by Andrew, and it actually makes me feel a lot of relief because yesterday we had a very good panel discussion that wrapped up the whole day, and then I was quite worried that I'll have to do a wrap up for today, but now I don't have to do the wrap up. Andrew has helped me to outsource the work to the people on stage. So very quick wrap up. Don't worry, we'll end by 5:30. Okay, so I'll hand over the mic to Andrew, and he'll carry out the panel discussion. Okay, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jonathan. This is very impromptu, but we've had such a wonderful day, and I want to say this, compliments to everybody here, but we have had a very intensive information overload day. So I thought that it may be very useful, and I discussed with Jan, that it may be very useful to have a little bit of summing up, like what we did yesterday. Because when you get too much information, it's very difficult to digest. Somebody told me at my table, well, is this too deep? But I thought that if we actually were to be able to try and sum up this complexity, we'll do this very well. Let me just say, very, very quickly, sort of my own take on this. Firstly, it would be very useful to say that what we've had is very interesting. But I don't like the word interesting. Interesting is actually a very ambiguous word. Because if you don't understand it, you just say it's very interesting. But actually, today's presentations were, in my view, all the speakers, brilliant, original, eye-opening, and in many ways, mind-blowing. This is not faint praise. This is my own honest assessment of what we have received today. But I thought it would be important for us to get this discussion. So what we decided after discussion with Jan is that this conference is dedicated to the young. So what we wanted to start first is with Xuan Min. Xuan Min's from RI. Unfortunately, Ambassador Bilahari cannot come, so we have invited also Professor Brian Arthur. Brian Arthur, for some of you who do not know, is someone who has contributed a lot through complexity economics and systems thinking. And so I think I would like to get, after Xuan Min, Brian will try to give his take on what we have learned in the last 2 days within the field of systems thinking, so that you get a benefit of his insights. And then I've asked each of the remaining speakers today to do the same thing, summarize what they thought from the questions that you've asked, how we have understood or not understood, or we feel that we have got something more from today than all the last 2 days. So we're looking forward to this feast. But just before that, an advertisement. The whole purpose of getting you remaining here is to make sure that you join us for dinner tonight, whereas Dekai's team is going to have this wonderful musical presentation for us. Now, why music? We talk a little bit about this. Do any of you know why, when we toast to each other, we touch glasses? Does anybody know? We have all the wine experts. George, do you know? I know. Yeah, please explain.
Okay, when you eat or drink, you look, you smell, you taste, get the texture. Wine is not a very good example, but certainly food. And then what do you hear? Well, for wine, it's very simple. You toast. And if you don't clean the glass, you lose something of the social fabric and personal pleasure of wine. But in food, cracking, crunchy taste are also very important. So we eat also through our ears, from inside or from outside. Now, don't clean your eardrums because there's no food there and no wine.
Thank you, George. Okay, now let's start. Xuan Min, give us your take on what you've learned today. How do you feel about the whole conference so far?
Thank you very much. And after listening to the previous brilliant speeches, I saw this, the relationship between the East and the West in 3 ways. First would be in terms of science, second in terms of language, and third would be my role as a Singaporean youth. So for science, as an arts student, I cannot claim to represent the entire student population, but I'll try my best anyway. And I felt that the speeches presented opportunities for integrating the East and the West in terms of biomedicine and traditional Chinese medicine. So in terms of my daily life, I felt that this could be represented because the school management at RI refuses to recognize TCM as a legitimate medical certificate. So if you decide to miss school, we need to go visit a doctor who practices Western biomedicine. So that's a place that school management could work on. And the second point would be my mother's decision, because her passion for TCM means that she uses me as a guinea pig to practice the TCM. So I believe that with improvements in biomedicine, I will not be needed as a guinea pig anymore. But I felt that it was more relevant in language because it's very important when the speaker talked about the role of language in terms of changing the way in which we perceive the world. And it's very important because in Singapore there's a policy of bilingualism, so we're forced to learn both English and our mother tongue. But I felt that across the years, Singaporean youths have developed an apathy towards learning our mother tongue, and this resulted in a loss of cultural heritage because I remember that she mentioned that despite knowing one's mother tongue doesn't mean we exactly fully understand our cultural heritage and tradition. So this kind of loss, because I felt that as my parents talked to me, it's kind of concerning that people of other cultures, especially from the West, know more about the Chinese culture than us Chinese youths in Singapore. So I feel that there's a lot of improvements that can be made in terms of East and the West, in terms of engaging Singaporean youths and my peers in terms of improving relations between both parties. Yeah. And in terms of changing the world, I believe that, first of all, as a youth, there's not much that we can do now, but in the future. But in terms of Singapore, I feel that our role and our ability to act as a bridge between the East and the West should not be overstated. Because despite good relations between the United States and Singapore, as well as, for instance, in the past where former Premier Deng Xiaoping visited Singapore and used Singapore as a model to develop China, I feel that recent tensions between Singapore and China, when the Chinese Foreign Ministry warned Singapore about siding with the West over South China Sea, shows that international relations are still very fragile and that politics continue to define cultural understandings of one another. And this is considering that both cultural understandings and politics do influence one another. So I think that Singapore's status as a bridge between the East and the West still remains strong, but definitely not invulnerable. Because after all, two tigers will never fear the little red dot that is Singapore. So lastly, the similarities between the East and the West have been shown throughout the conference to be more than just biological, cultural, political, and overall as a civilization. And by this also causes concern, because my history teacher once told me that when two entities want different things, you can fulfill both desires. But when you have two entities that desire the same thing, this ultimately leads into a clash of interests. But I believe that this clash of interests can actually be beneficial when we, or in particular my generation, can arrive at a unified vision of our objective in the way in which we envision the progression of mankind. And the differences between the East and the West can also be seen as a driver for change, and that is ultimately what I believe is the point of this conference. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you for a very good representation from how the youth sees, at least this conference of what we're trying to get there. Brian?
Well, it's very difficult to follow the previous speaker. Thank you very much. I'm not kidding. Also, I want to congratulate all of you here. You're still here, and it's at the end of the second day. That's a tribute to the organizers and to all of us. These are not particularly simple issues we're looking at. We're really looking at differences in culture. And Jan, maybe I missed something, and Andrew, as organizers, but I'm wondering why we have had no anthropologists here speaking. They're the holders of, or they understand and look at cultures and how cultures are put together and structured and how they operate and how they differ. perhaps next time, I don't mean that as a criticism, but we've had a couple of philosophers telling us that, well, these differences may exist in your mind, but if you go into them in more detail, they kind of wash out a bit. I very much like the previous talk, in spite of what I've just said. I'm all for ambiguity, by the way, and there are differences, I think, as you said, Lisa. I grew up in a culture that treasured ambiguity, and that's Ireland. The ambiguity would be such that you run into somebody and they say, you're looking terrible. And then you'd have to say, yes, it's true, I'm looking terrible these days. But it's not so bad, you're looking very well. Oh yes, I'm feeling well. So to an American, and I went to America when I was 21, that sort of conversation is totally unintelligible. But the purpose of the conversation is not to exchange information. It's to exchange agreement. And the cultural thing that I believe does exist because America floored me, people wanted precision, is that very often language is not just about information, it's about agreement, it's about connection, it's about heart opening, it's about description. And so I very much like this talk, Lisa. I was going to ask you a question. I hadn't maybe the nerve to do so. But I like ambiguity, and I remember just 3 or 4 words from the poet Keats. Most cottage trees. It's out of some slightly longer poem he wrote, some description. And then it struck me that the ambiguity there is completely and utterly intentional, so that you can fill that ambiguity with some picture in your own mind. You get to use your own imagination. If the poet preempted your imagination was terribly precise, then there'd be less to do and you would gain less. The ambiguity and the irony is that Lisa is a poet herself, who's very precise, and I wondered, I don't mean to be rude here, but I wondered how being a poet and being such a precise philosopher fits together. The other remark I want to make, and this touches on several of the talks yesterday and today. Several people mentioned complexity. I know Andrew did, and Atsushi here did, but several others mentioned complexity. And that left me wondering, what is it about complexity that is worth mentioning in a forum like this? And it kept coming up. I'm not sure myself, and I've been sort of pondering that. Why should complexity arise when we're discussing the difference between Eastern culture and Western culture, if we're allowed to say East and West, which I will here. And I can't quite find an answer, but if you have an answer, I would love to hear it. I'll attempt one. It seems to me that an awful lot of teaching and insight and wisdom is given in the East, as I understand it. I'm talking about China, Korea, Japan, and that end of Asia, so East Asia. A lot of teaching and wisdom is given actually by being ambiguous or by paradox. The Tao that can be talked of, the Tao that can be Taoed is not the Tao. The Tao that can be spoken of is not the Tao. Now to a Westerner, that's sort of, well, if you can't speak of it, what can you do with it? So for us, this is a paradox. But a lot of the teaching that I find particularly wise is telling you that you can think of A as B, but you can also think of A as not B. And it's left open, and you have to fill in the differences yourself. And if you can fill in those differences almost like a koan in Zen Buddhism, you yourself have got a lot wiser. So the East tends to teach through paradox. Now the West, our tradition didn't have that so much. Maybe the ancient Greeks had it, I don't know. But certainly since the Enlightenment or since science came along in the 1600s, we valued precision. And the strange thing, and this is what I like about modern science, is that it got more and more and more precise. And as it got more precise, it would take things that it treasured, ideas like truth, maybe, or even beauty, or precision, or predictability, and as it went into each of these concepts and bore down on them more and more and more finely, with more precision, they all came apart and revealed a world that is much more organic and ambiguous than we thought. Let me put this another way, if this sounds a bit mysterious. The science I was taught and grew up with saw the world, and this is very much an Enlightenment point of view in the West, saw the world as ordered and predictable and somehow in some form of stasis or homeostasis or some form of equilibrium, and also in some form of harmony, that there was some goodness to this outcome in some way. As we went on into the 20th century and the 21st century and bore down on biological sciences, the algorithmic sciences, and complexity sciences, which are basically algorithmic, we found that none of these were true. Trivially, in California, where I live, we have earthquake or earth systems, seismic systems, but earthquakes are notoriously not predictable, yet they're perfectly physical. So what we're finding as we look more and more deeply into science, and this is where complexity comes up, is that the world is organic and evolving and not necessarily predictable, and not necessarily in equilibrium. It's always discovering something new, and not necessarily in harmony, perhaps in some degree of disharmony. And to me and to many others here, a vast revelation is that, we were very proud we'd got there, we had got rid of the Enlightenment, we were looking at all of these slightly open, disordered systems. Can you predict earthquake systems in advance? Can you predict when someone will die, etc.? Is everybody else always in perfection? Absolutely not. If someone asks me, would I kindly define complexity? I say, well, do you have teenage children? It's a complex system. It's not always in harmony or perfection. You're just getting by. When we made all those discoveries in science and physics and physical chemistry, also in mathematics, in my field of economics, that the world is basically organic, somewhat disordered, non-predictable, we were all floored to find out that the Chinese had got there 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. For me, this was a real thrill. And for many of us in the complexity area, this was brilliant. What I learned this morning in the absolutely dazzling talk I heard from Atsushi is that the East, or Japan if you want, can take Western scientific concepts and itself arrive at these same conclusions, that it's too narrow to see our world as ordered and harmonious and perfect, the world is basically, this is a view of holism, organicism, and evolution, everything always unfolding. So the bottom line here is that science itself is discovering thoughts and a holism and a non-perfection that's long been known in the East. The East is discovering matters of precision, perfection, and mechanism that we've talked about in the West. And I'm not sure we've arrived at anything like a consensus or even a conversation on this yet, but it's potentially there. So I think this has been a fabulous meeting, and thank you very much for organizing it.
Oh, thank you. Before I move to Professor IRIKI, I just want to say that, we are all lost in translation. Okay? We're all lost in translation. And, if you really think through it, Professor Francis Fukuyama, who's actually Japanese, if I'm not wrong, born in America, was the guy who wrote The End of History, and then discovered it was not the end of history, it was only the beginning. And that's exactly the process and the cycle that we are going through. We are all hybrids, and history is unfolding before us. And I think Professor Brian Arthur has made this very good transition for Professor IRIKI to explain how he is converging that East and West. Okay. Professor IRIKI.
Well, I think we have achieved a lot through these 2 days. And that makes me unsatisfaction. I think this is because this is not criticism. If we are at the middle of achievement, we are just satisfied with what we have achieved. But since we are reached the maturations or saturations, whatever you call, then start unsatisfied about it. So that's approaching a limit. And Eastern culture and Western culture is now experiencing a similar thing. Eastern philosophy have been achieved a lot and almost achieved the completion after 3,000 years or 4,000 years, whatever you say. And that's why having a trouble these few hundred years. And that process of achievement was very slow because of the technology and whatever, there's many reasons. And then to overcome it, or the different way, Western science, modern science, start achieving 400 years ago. And it was very quick in speed. And that's achieved very quickly. And it's about reaching saturation. So both civilizations are unsatisfied with themselves. And that's why we are seeking for partners to unify. I think this is the current situation. And this is similar to what we have achieved 2 days, a lot. But there are several unsatisfaction. Because of that, I'm feeling is that we have heard a lot about analysis of Eastern culture by using English, which is some sort of Western culture. And that lacks a vocabulary to explain it. Like your talk, I think your talk is saying that each culture, each side have their own precision and accuracy and ambiguity on the other side. And so we didn't hear anything about analysis of Western culture by Eastern lenses. Perhaps we don't have a vocabulary, or we can recognize ourselves by looking from outside. That's something we have to do. And I was just imaginary thinking by listening to your talk is that we Japanese appreciate Chinese poet a lot, and Li Bai, and we read in a Japanese way. And we never feel it ambiguous, but it's richness and double meaning, polysemy, and richness of the depth of the meaning. That we very much appreciate. Never feel it ambiguous, we're unsatisfied with this. Probably the English vocabulary doesn't have the word to express it. And so that's why the Easterners are having some problems. And I think we have to find a way to evaluate the Western civilization in the Eastern lenses or Eastern vocabulary. And I think it has never been attempted. And the reason is that the quickness of the Western achievement, so reducing into limited elements and quantifying it, it makes comparison easy. So if you evaluate, the world is now competing with each other, and Mr. Ambassador claimed that they think as a unit, as a state, not as a culture. So we have to make a competition between the states or the groups in quick evaluation system, which Western culture have a deep or strong advantage over the Eastern culture. And that's where we are now living. And having said it, I am professional, regard myself a hardcore Western scientist. And in that sense, Easterners are minority in Western civilization or Western scientific world or evaluation system. And minority tends to be extreme fundamentalist to achieve or evaluate it through the different culture. So probably the Easterners competing in Western environment becomes more extreme fundamentalist, like a Chinese is becoming extreme capitalist. I don't know if it is a proper analogy, but that's have frustration of Easterners. Also by lacking the vocabulary to evaluate the West or lacking the chance to do that. And this is a too extreme unsatisfaction that I have started experiencing through super achievement over 2 days. And I will leave it for future conferences.
Thank you very much. George, just one word to emphasize for someone who is trying to appreciate what IRIKI-san is trying to think through. There is a historical parallel. Kang Youwei was the philosopher behind the reform of the dying days of the Qing dynasty. His pupil, Liang Qichao, was Japanese trained. And as you know, Kang Youwei's reforms failed because he was trying to reform a dying monarchy. But he still believed it was possible to retain the Qing dynasty and reform China. But his disciple, Liang Qichao, and it was very difficult for the disciple to rebel against his master. Remember this. Liang Qichao decided that after a while, his master was wrong and that he had to follow Sun Yat-sen and go for the republic. So, we're actually at that phase, depending on whether you believe it or not, that, when the East is beginning to change, one had to change this issue. Okay, just very quick, George.
Well, when I was the student's age, I learned a proverb, an Indian proverb, an ancient Indian proverb, and I still think it's very important. The proverb is, the higher the monkey climbs, the more he shows his ass. Of course, this is not exactly what you want to write in your next dissertation, but I think it's something you have to keep in mind because it shows, and I think this conference more than anything, many a few other, shows that things as we believe them or as we think are true change. And you can call that ambiguity, you can call that quantum physics, you can call that quantum biology, which I'm trying to study now, not to study, but to be involved in. The concepts that exist today, whether you are young or older, and Atsushi illustrated that, are subject to change for a huge number of reasons. He pointed to the main ones, but there are others. And more importantly, I don't know if you have seen this wonderful photo of an iceberg that was published a few years ago in National Geographic. It's a beautiful photo. So what you see is the whole iceberg. And the iceberg below the surface of the water is blue with different shades of blue. Above the surface is a bit blue, and the tip is white, and the sky is blue. So it's beautiful. And I asked my students, what do you think? And they raised their hand. Well, this is the whole knowledge, and we only know what's above the surface, 10%. And then I say, think about it. What you see is 10%? Yes. I say, no, you see the surface. And that's 0.1%. So that makes you a little bit humble. Because when, for instance, politicians, by training, use sound bites and slogans, because they are easy to capture, easy to swallow, easy to digest, but I don't know if it's going to change the mind of any human being, smart or stupid. What we know is that, and Socrates said, and Plato repeated that, the only thing I know is that I know nothing. Of course, it's not entirely true. We have built everything we know on knowledge and use of complex systems to create things. But the fundamental nature of humans and how they function, how they act, how they react, how they love, how to enjoy, and what makes us human remains to be studied. I don't know if it will be discovered, but at least this is a very ambitious goal, and I'm very glad to be part of it.
Thank you very much. Lisa, you have the last word.
Oh dear. What I'd like to use a few words for is to look at some issues that I think are under the surface of what we've been talking about the past few days, and issues that perhaps could be explored. And so, since someone said that threes are good to think with, I'll name three. The first is, we've talked a lot about language and a lot about medicine in one way or another. And it seems to me that an issue beneath that is the relationship of minds and bodies, which are sites for complex cultural differences and also unity, since we, after all, I think, have minds and bodies. So this is one area that I think is under the surface of what we've been talking about. Another, for lack of a better word, is efficacy. That is, I think we all recognize certain kinds of felicitous actions, but we describe them differently with more or less ambiguity or clarity. And this is, again, another, I think, element that's skirting around what we've been talking about. And the third is pushing that one step further outwards to what I'm going to describe as ritual, although it's an awkward word. That is, the ways in which we organize social practices, which again are where a lot of complexities arise in interactions. And all of these, of course, involve language, but go beyond language in that they involve actions as well as language. And I'm going to stop there in the interest of time.
Thank you very much. Lisa, you know, your talk today opened my eyes to many issues. Ambiguity is very important. In the words of a very distinguished central banker, Alan Greenspan, if you understood what I said, you got it wrong. And I think that clears it very, 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 very much. I think we're all in the age of exploration, of discovery, and we're in that journey. It's not easy. Your talk actually this afternoon had a phrase which I must repeat. In Chinese is 以义逆字. What it means is your translation, which is one should use what one construes from a text to trace the author's intent. I translated it as, don't use your definition or meaning to misinterpret or twist the author's intended meaning. Okay? This goes to show, actually, the Chinese language has got slightly different meanings to different people. So, ambiguity is very good. It actually is a transition to different meanings. To sum up this whole 2 days, we've asked many questions, but we don't know the answers. Well, certainly, we haven't tried to answer. But to end today with the words of a Nobel laureate, the answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. Thank you very much indeed. Now let's thank all the panelists, especially Xuan Min, for his courage to be here. But I'm sure he'll go very, very far from today. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. And thank you all for your patience for being here. And very, very good listeners.